Let's talk about intelligence and intercepting the messages that the enemy is sending during a time of warfare. This is nothing new. It goes way back to ancient times. They had ways of encoding messages, which if I start on that, we'll be here tonight all night. Wellington was aware that Bonaparte was using codes, and famously George Scoville, that's his portrait on the right, was the code breaker. So we were managing to read those messages that the French were sending between themselves, even though they were in code. Little entry here from the American Civil War. This doesn't involve any decoding. A Confederate officer dropped some cigars, and they were wrapped around Special Order number 191 from Robert E. Lee. And these cigars were picked up, and the message was identified, and it was taken to McClellan, who could have then acted on the information, but he didn't. This is an example from the First World War. It's the Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans, come 1914, the Germans were quite advanced. They managed wireless radio, and they encoded their messages. The Russians were rather struggled with the technology, and so they were struggling even to use radios. So they were sending messages in clear speech. So the Germans were picking up messages in Russian, and they learned very quickly that the Russians had two armies. If I remember correctly, Second Army was ready to go when the war opened, but it would take First Army several days to be ready. So the Germans used this to very good advantage, attacked the army that was ready to fight, and put a lot of troops in there, knowing that they could get a superior numbers for a short while, and then switch their armies up to engage with with what I think was Rennenkampf's First Army. So that's having intelligence of your enemy's situation and using it very wisely. World War One, the Royal Navy realized that the Germans were sending messages in code between their ships, and so they set up Room 40, because it was room number 40 at the Admiralty, to break naval codes. Now, I think this is a wonderful photograph, and we see here that we've only got three gentlemen in uniform. So there we go, 1, 2, 3 gentlemen in uniform. We've got one gentleman who looks to be a civilian, and 3 women in the room. So even in World War One, women are taking an important part in code breaking, and we'll see that especially at Bletchley Park. Now, one of the team in room 40 was a guy called Dilly Knox. He's a classic scholar from Cambridge, and his particular speciality was I should have practiced saying this, a papyrologist, i.e. reading Egyptian documents, which of course were symbols. So it's not 100 miles different in looking at encoded messages, comparing that to what he'd learned how to interpret papyrus, and he was highly skilled. Now, World War One, rather important. The Americans didn't join in when the Lusitania was sunk in 1915. It took them till 1917 before the American government could get the commitment to join in the war. And one of the key issues was the Zimmerman telegram, which was intercepted by the British, who then decoded it and shared with the Americans what the Zimmerman telegram was. So it was a message from Berlin to Mexico, and the next slide shows the decoded message, and it basically translates as, we think America could join in the war. It would really help the German cause if Mexico decided to attack America as well. and we'll see you right afterwards. We will support you. This would help our cause. And if you look kind of way down on the, they mention Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, i.e., when the war's over, when Germany's been successful, we will make sure we will help you to acquire those territories, Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. And there it is. That's the decoded message, which brought America into the First World War. Lots of people need to get credit for this. When I went to Bletchley Park, I thought, oh, it's Alan Turing and a few other people helping him. But no, there were a lot of people need to take a lot of credit alongside Alan Turing. And way back in the early 1930s, the Polish knew that the Germans were up to all kinds of mischief and had their eyes on Poland. And some very, very clever Polish mathematicians were working on breaking the Enigma code. Interestingly, the Enigma machine was a commercially available piece of kit. And I think it was a guy in Switzerland invented it, hoping to sell it to banks and governments and armies and so on. The British looked at it and decided that it wasn't secure enough. We will come to that. So these lovely people, Rajowski, Zalinsky, and Rosicki, my apologies for anyone who speaks Polish properly, these guys were already making great inroads into working out how the Enigma machine worked and how to decrypt it. This is the brainchild of Mr. Zegalski, and these sheets with perforations, these could help you begin to decode messages. You'd kind of hold two sheets against one another, look through them and see where the light shines through in the gaps. The important thing is that they were making inroads into deciphering Enigma codes. Enigma is not the only encryption device used in World War II. On the left is the Lorentz machine, which we will come to later. That was the most secure device that the Germans had. Top right, we have something of the SG, Schlüsselgerät, the key machine. That came in 1944, used by the Abwehr, and Bletchley Park didn't manage to break that. So that was problematic. And another example down there, the Italian Navy used the Halligan C-36. The British machine is the Typex device. Now, the British assessed the Enigma when it became available after World War I and thought, well, it's very clever. However, it has one major failure, which is that a letter can never be represented by itself. So the letter A is going to be some other letter, but it can't be A. And they reckon that was a loophole. And without going into great detail, this is actually key to exploiting how messages could be decrypted. So we had something called the Typex device. And interestingly, if you'd worked out the settings for an Enigma machine, you could then get a Typex device to mimic an Enigma machine. So you could use a Typex to decode an Enigma transcript once you'd worked out what the settings of the day were. Flow of signal intelligence. Each of these steps needs to be done properly to actually get some real benefit. So first of all, you need to intercept the enemy's message. So if it's a written down message, you need to grab hold of it. If it's a wireless message, you need to intercept it. Of course, is what's happening in World War II. Then you need to break the code if you can. Once you know how the message has been encoded, you can then decrypt it. If you've decrypted it, you then translate it. Then you analyze it, and keywords can be indexed. This is how Bletchley Park, they were identifying new bits of German equipment. Whenever a new word appeared, they would carefully write it in an index and then cross-reference it whenever they saw it again. Then share the intelligence, and be careful who you share with. and then act on the intelligence or choose not to. Because if the only way you've learned about this particular item is through breaking codes, and that's the only way that the Germans could possibly have revealed this to you, well, if you then act on it, you're basically broadcasting to the Germans that you've broken their codes, which is a problem. So one example of this is very often the Allies would kind of discover something, then they'd think, well, we need to kind of have some other way of knowing this. So they would then fly over a Spitfire on a photographic reconnaissance mission, and the Germans would, of course, look up in the sky and say, Spitfire flying very high. Oh, they've seen our tank movements or whatever. So you have to be very careful how you use the intelligence. Right, listening stations. So Bletchley Park is also known as Station X. That's the Roman numeral for 10. Early on, Bletchley Park was a listening station as well, but they then decided they would move the listening function out of Bletchley and just do the decryption work at Bletchley. Why was Bletchley Park chosen? Well, there's a railway line between Oxford and Cambridge, and around the middle is Bletchley, and they thought, well, we need some of these clever people from the senior universities in the UK. So if we position this on the railway line between them, then we'll have access to these clever people. And early on, when they started looking at it, the code word, the hidden cover for it was Captain Ridley's shooting party. Here's the guy that started Bletchley Park, the senior naval officer, Alistair Guthrie Denniston. He was there so he was head of government code and cipher schools. It all ties in with Room 40 at the Admiralty, and he serves from 1919 to February 1942. So he's a very capable guy, and he understands the importance of catching the enemy's signals and then understanding the content thereof. He understands why that's important. They constructed several huts at Bletchley. The naval Enigma was deciphered in Hut 8. That's where they broke the codes, when they could break the codes, and then they passed them on to Hut 4. Other messages, non-naval, was deciphered in Hut 6 and then passed on to Hut 3. Now, the Navy arguably need to have the hardest codes to break. The way I see it is a ship is a kind of fairly stable platform. You want to be very secretive, and so you are able to take time in encoding and decoding messages. Whereas with the army, they tend to kind of moving a fair bit. With the RAF and the Luftwaffe, aeroplanes are flying, so you need to message your pilots in as simple language as possible so they can react quickly. There's a rather amazing photograph of Guderian, the famous German tank commander, and here we see him in a half track, and you can see the team working with an Enigma machine. This is a 3-rotor Enigma, and what you've got is, so there's the message in German that needs to be encoded. He's pressing a key on the keyboard, and that will then light up a letter, the encoded letter, and the chap to his right is then writing down the resulting letters. This is an attempt to explain how the Enigma encodes a letter. So the example we've got here is on the keyboard. On the keyboard, they press the operator has pressed the letter T. That signal, that letter, then goes to the plug board, which is where they've got the cables. Which is, if you remember those old images of the telephone exchanges, with the typically it was ladies, connecting you now, they shove a cable into a hole. So the plug board here converts the T to a K. That then goes through a static wheel The K goes into the right-hand wheel, and in that particular rotor, that converts to a U. That goes across the middle wheel, the U becomes a P, goes to the leftmost wheel, that P becomes an H. The H then goes to the reflector, the scrambler, that does another conversion. The H becomes a D, comes back, D becomes G, G becomes R becomes W, and the W comes back out to the plug board, and the W then gets converted again into a G. So it's the G. So in this instance, the T becomes a G. Now, what happens next is very clever. The rotors move on one click. The rightmost rotor moves on one click, and it changes the comparative positions of the rotors. So if you press T again, another different letter will come out. It won't be a T, but it's not going to be a G. It's going to be a different letter again. This next slide shows this fairly well. So in this instance, in the top diagram, A has gone through the various rotors and comes out as a G. Then A has been pressed again, and the rightmost rotor has gone round one click. It's moved clockwise or anti-clockwise, one letter. So the A comes out as a C in this example. If they press A a third time, it will come out as yet another different letter. So the right-hand rotor goes round once for every letter that's been pressed. When that's done a complete rotation, the middle rotor goes round one click. And then when the middle rotor, over a period of time, when that's gone round a complete circuit, then the left-hand rotor goes round another click. There's Dilly Knox again, the gentleman who was involved in World War I. And he could see that the Polish were onto a bright idea, and he's involved in pulling in Alan Turing to say, can we find some way of breaking this? And can we find some mechanical way or electronic way of breaking these codes? Hut 8 is where the naval code breaking was done. So Alan Turing was there. There's his photograph. This is the office where he worked. This is where he had a bit of privacy to himself. And famously, and here we go, if you look on the bottom right, there's his enamel mug chained to the radiator, because he was always rather keen to just have this one mug, and he didn't want it to go, anyone to take it away, so he chained it to the radiator. Hut 6, these are the reconstructed huts at Bletchley Park. Non-naval code breaking, and you go and visit there, and they'll various interpretive panels like this. Now, just to introduce another term to you, the intelligence that they generated at Bletchley Park was known with the British services as ultra. The Americans use the term magic. This is an intercepted German message in code. And you can see that they've set it up. So they've set up this hut for the 28th of February 1941. This was the day they made a particularly useful break. And you can see that the encoded message is in blocks of 5 letters. And of course, there's no gaps, there's no proper punctuation. So this is the incoming raw material. And somehow the code breakers needed to try to work out what those letters stood for. So the first H won't be the letter H, and if you press H again, it'll come out something different. The early Polish attempt to break Enigma used what they called a Bombe with an A on the end, and this is a model, a reconstruction at Bletchley of how the Polish people tried to do this. Turing developed an electronic method using a rather different approach, and this is the Bombe. I call it the Bombe, and so you have multiple sets of 3 dials going round, and these are mimicking the Enigma machine. And so The initial settings are the best possible guess as to what the settings might be for the day, and they would feed these in. And what they're looking for is they're looking for a crib. So let's take a bit of German that you might see quite often, which would be, say, alles in Ordnung, means everything in order, everything's going okay. You'd be looking for a decrypted word that looked to be that message. These dials are kind of ticking away, so it sounded like the ticking of a bomb. And the top row goes faster, the middle row goes at a middle speed, and the bottom row goes a bit slower. So it's making multiple guesses all at once. And you could set these up, and maybe the bomber will find a solution, maybe in 30 minutes, maybe in an hour, maybe in 2 hours, maybe 4 hours. Maybe it'll never find a break. However, it's the same settings every day across that particular service. So the German Navy had one set, the Army had another set, and the Luftwaffe had a different set. But if you could break the code, say on something fairly straightforward like a weather report, you've then got the settings for the day. You can then feed that in and find messages that are rather more important. Yeah, von Manstein is going to move his panzers today. They're going to go to such and such a place. That's a very useful piece of information to know. We can't just say it was all Alan Turing. There was several other people who made very important contributions. So in terms of the bombers, we will give credit to Peter Twin, Gordon Welshman, and Harold Keane, amongst others. And of course, these machines were managed by women, typically wrens, who would be on their feet all day long. It was hard work. It was physically hard work. This diagram, I took the photograph at Bletchley. If you can understand what this diagram is saying, it shows how helpful the bombers were in actually breaking the codes. So in terms of codes broken, in 1939, when they had no bombers available, so they're manually trying to break the codes, they've got no bombers, they broke 16 codes. 1940, they've got 2 bombers, they've broken 426. 1941, 16 bombers. 1991. As things progress, America comes into the war and American resources become available, and the Americans, bless them, manufacture more bombers, which we're able to use. And so we get more and more bombers available. The Americans are using them as well. And you can see on the left-hand side that by 1944, we've got an enormous number of codes broken because we've got more bombers available. 1945, of course, the war in Europe finishes in May, so it's not a full year. Now, the Germans are a clever nation, and they must have known that we were trying to break their codes. We claim that they never really knew that we were. Actually, they were breaking our codes as well. We can't claim that it was only the Allies. So they're a wily lot, particularly the Kriegsmarine with the U-boat service and so on. And from February 1942, they introduce a 4-rotor Enigma machine. So you've got to re-equip all the naval service, and you've got to make sure they've all got the code books, but it's an extra rotor. So if you remember that diagram of the code going through from right to left and then back again on 3 rotors, oh, there's an extra rotor, so it's even harder to decrypt. And for a period, Bletchley Park were blind. Why can't we? They didn't know for some time that what the Germans had done was introduce an extra rotor. There was a very important moment. Now, I'm sorry to disappoint our American friends. The Hollywood blockbuster U-571 is fiction. It wasn't the Americans that grabbed code books. It was actually a British ship, and the U-559 had been intercepted and was on the point of sinking. 3 very brave sailors, including young Tommy Brown, went into the U-boat, and somehow Tommy Brown managed to grab the code books. He came out with the code books, which were then passed on to Bletchley Park. Absolutely brilliant. We can now see what the Germans do. We can break their codes for this month and whatever other months they got the code sheets for. Tragically, 2 of the other sailors drowned in that U-boat as it went down. But that was an amazing break for Bletchley Park. 3 rotor Enigmas, 4 rotor Enigmas, they're hard enough. But the Germans had something even harder to break. This is the Lorentz machine, which is basically a teleprinter with encryption added to it. And you can see, if I show you, see that there's 12 rotors on this thing. Now, this was very hard to break the codes of. It was only actually used for the most senior German hubs, shall we call them? So Berlin going out to, should we say, Paris or Rome or wherever. There's only 30 in operation, and these were really, really hard to break. And so some very bright people worked on some electronic means to try to help break the Lorentz. This is called Tuny. The code name was Tuny. So Max Newman, there he is, top right, designed it, and this very bright guy, Tommy Flowers from the post office, built Colossus. It's the first working electronic computer in the world. Now, this was very, very hard to break, but there was one particular instance where a German operator made a big slip. So the story goes that it was the evening, and this particular guy, let's pretend he's the fellow there with glasses with the swastika on it. This particular guy is having to send quite a long message via Lorentz to such and such a location. And he wants to get finished promptly. He wants to finish work so that he can then go to this big party. And he spends however long, say it's an hour, encrypting the message, typing it in, encrypting it, and he sends it off. And the message comes through over the radio from the other end, not got the message, haven't got the message, not come through. Actually, been transmitted okay. There was a problem at their end. The British had actually intercepted the message, so we had the first version already. So we'd started working on it. So the guy then thinks, "Oh, I want to be at this party." So what he does is he retransmits the message, but wherever he can abbreviate, wherever he can shorten a word so he can get the message out quicker, that's what he did. So the second version goes out, and it's shorter than the first one. And the decryptors at Bletchley are saying, well, this is very odd. It's gone from the same place to the same destination. It starts the same. It's shorter. What's happened? And some bright fella says, oh, there's abbreviations there. So they're going through and they're seeing where words have become shorter. So tank, Kampfpanzerwagen, but you can change that to KPWG and so on. And that enabled them to break those codes. So that was a particular instance. Now, hooray for the Americans. Thank you for coming and helping us in World War II. We're very grateful. And the Americans have got some skills in code breaking. They come and the policy is, let's work together. So various Americans came and got established at Bletchley Park. And we also sent some Allied soldiers out to the Pacific as well. And the cooperation was very useful. And as I mentioned before, the Americans were making bombers because they had the resources to do it. Now, the Germans screwed up royally on this front. They didn't have a single code breaking service. They had multiple code breaking services. Each group, so I'd already mentioned that the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine and the the Luftwaffe all had separate services. So there's no central agency. You've got multiple agencies, and they're all in competition with one another with horrible rivalry. Some of them hated the other guys more than they hated the Allies. It's extraordinary. So you've got the German mail service. You've got you can kind of see them there. You've got the West Front Army. They've got the East Front Army. Worst of the lot is actually, and this is under Goering, you've got there's the Forschungsamt, the research office. They aren't listening into what the Allies are saying. They're actually eavesdropping on their own people. So the Forschungsamt under Goering was actually listening in on fellow Germans, listening in on the telephones and other communications to make sure that everyone was being a good Nazi. We don't want any traitors in our midst. So these guys under Goering, who of course was very keen to keep in with Hitler, they're dedicating their time and effort not into improving the German war effort, but actually spying on other Germans. Extraordinary. The Japanese had encryption as well. They had a different form of encryption. I tried to get my head around it and struggled, but it involved numbers and so on. Now, the Americans were doing their best to try to decrypt the codes, and there's a particular ruse where they thought, well, the Japanese are up to some mischief, and we think it might be Midway, but we're not sure. From the decrypted codes, we know that they're talking about putting in a big attack at location AF. How can we confirm that AF is the target? So Jasper Holmes, there he is on the left, had a bright idea, and he approaches his senior guy, Joseph Roquefort, and he says, here's an idea. Let's send out a message that the desalination plant has broken at Midway. It hasn't, but we're going to send out the message. We say, we've got big problems at Midway. Desalination plant is broken. We're going to have to work hard to get this fixed, to get drinkable water. So they go to the radio operator and says, send out this message. He says, this is a load of rubbish. This isn't true at all. He says, just send the message. And lo and behold, shortly afterwards, the Japanese intercept that message, and they're then sending out encrypting messages saying the desalination plant is broken at AF, i.e. the guess was correct. AF is Midway, so they could prepare for it. Now, the British had a wonderful ruse. I love sharing this story. The Japanese thought that first of all, their codes were unbreakable, and secondly, their language was so hard that you couldn't learn the language. The Western person couldn't learn to speak Japanese. Well, we had some very bright people. There was a particular captain who spoke Japanese very well, and he was teaching military Japanese on a 6-month course. What they were then doing was these officers who spoke Japanese were then mixing with Japanese officer prisoners of war. Now, if you think of the Japanese mindset, they think that to be taken prisoner is very, very shameful. You should commit suicide. You should commit seppuku because you shouldn't be taken prisoner. It's a very shameful thing to do. And if you are taken prisoner, well, that's the most horrible thing that can happen. So you don't deserve to be treated properly. So the Japanese were very surprised that they were well treated by the British. And the British officers would come and sit with them and have a nice dinner together. And the cleverness of the British here was that they would talk over dinner, and the officers would talk to one another and with the Japanese about how the codes were being broken and how they were working things out. And the Japanese were absolutely stunned. They were wrong-footed. There's things like, AF is Midway and so on. And well, we think Singapore is ZQ, and the Japanese officers were then kind of taken over and said, "Oh, honourable sir, but the code for Singapore is so and so." So the Japanese were actually kind of giving away information. Now, it's always good to have individual people that you can tell a good story for. Here is one of my great heroes, Mavis Beatty. What a wonderful lady she was. March 1941. Now, she never learnt Italian. She picked up Italian as she was working there. And in March 1941, she was reading the codes for the Italian naval Enigma, and she saw a message which said, "Today's the day -3." And shortly afterwards, 3 days later, the Italian battle fleet was sailing. So she reports this. Now, it's just such an amazingly useful piece of information. They've got 3 days warning that the Italians are sending out a big group of ships, including the Vittorio Veneto, which is one of the biggest ships there. And the Royal Navy could respond to it. They had an idea of what direction they were going. And this resulted in the Battle of Cape Matapan, where basically the Royal Navy ambushed the Italian Navy. And it was an absolute slaughter. You can see the casualties and losses there. Royal Navy, very few losses. The Italian Navy, the Regina Marina, considerable number of big ships lost and many sailors killed and prisoners of war. Incidentally, the gentleman that we remember as the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, was actually involved at the Battle of Cape Matapan. Now, normally the staff at Bletchley Park had no idea what contribution they were making. It was a huge secret. However, Cape Matapan was such an amazing result. They made an exception to this. So Admiral Cunningham, there he is on the right, called at Bletchley Park to congratulate Dilly and his girls, and that they were absolutely thrilled that the senior naval admiral had come, and Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, says, "Tell Dilly we have won a great victory in the Mediterranean, and it is entirely due to him and his girls." So thank you, Mavis Beatty. Bless you. And code breaking continues now. GCHQ at Cheltenham, for there it is continuing to monitor traffic. Of course, the whole business of modern military defense now uses computers and the internet, absolutely core to stuff. So GCHQ is arguably the modern descendant of Bletchley Park. That would be my final slide. There's Alan Turing. That's a statue of him at Bletchley Park. Dilly Knox on the right, Tommy Flowers on the bottom right.